of 5 daily salah and the entry inside the masajid, that should be the prerogative of each and every single human being in the world out there. That is your direct communication with Allah. That is your mi'raj of the mu'min. The salah, you communicate directly with him, not through middlemen. But we are not introducing people to this. And so people have this idea that Islam is foreign, it's something new, it's something which is just limited to a certain particular religious or cultural group, a certain racial stock, and so it's something unique. Be broad and be universalist as the Quran asks you and requests to be. And from that perspective, you will see more and more people entering the fold of Islam and giving away all these quack ideas and false belief systems and constructs and ideas. Now, just a quick idea. Now also, besides the New Age movement, you have something which is called New Atheism. You see, atheism is disbelief in God. Agnosticism is something else, but it's more of, on a lesser degree, a lack of concern, or it's not an actual denial of the existence of Allah, not a deliberate actual denial. Traditionally, atheists were those amongst people who came from sometimes a scientific background, not all of them, sometimes people who were skeptics and so on. Bertrand Russell as a classic example. But they were atheists because that was what they personally choose to believe. And if people do not want to believe in something, you cannot force them. It's a rejection of faith. They're committing an act of kufr, a deliberate rejection of faith. But that was very much a personal thing. Now, more recently, in the latter part of the 20th and 21st century, sorry? Yes.
No, I'm just saying the difference between ignorance and atheists.
Agnosticism. Yeah, agnosticism. I mean, agnosticism doesn't necessarily indicate a deliberate rejection of something higher up. An agnostic, for example, could contemplate that there may be or there may not be something up there. But atheism is something which is a deliberate rejection on the part of the individual, where he denies the existence of a human being. That would be the fundamental layman's definition of both these two particular concepts. Now, coming back to what I said, in the 20th and particularly early part of the 21st century, there's been this new trend developing called New Atheism. And New Atheism is particularly virulent. It's very acidic, because these people basically discuss their personal idea, their personal rejection, and promote it as the only way. So the classic example would be someone like Richard Dawkins, the late Christopher Hitchens, I think Sam Harris, and so on. These particular individuals just don't basically, are not atheists for the sake of being atheists, but for them, atheism is very much, if you could call it, part and parcel of a religion. So they would go out and promote this. They would go, particularly when we have the time, and when I'll show you on YouTube how Dawkins, for example, goes deliberately, even to Muslim communities. He doesn't debate religious scholars. He stays away from debating debaters. He was challenged by someone called William Lane Craig, who's a noted Christian philosopher debating the existence of God. He stays away from them, but he will go to ordinary lay people, lay Muslims, lay Christians, and actively engage in this promotion of atheism itself, or particularly the atheism which stems from the evolutionary biology that he promotes. He's an evolutionist. He believes in Darwin's theory of evolution to the letter. He promotes it aggressively. He believes that it should be part and parcel of the teachings in school, actively promoting it to say this should become part and parcel of the curriculum. He actively promotes the idea that all forms of religion should be eliminated from schooling, from the schooling curriculum entirely. He promotes the idea, for example, that in public settings, if, for example, anyone has a religious symbol or the headscarf for that matter, then that should be actually removed. And you find that, increasingly enough, these policies are being followed. I mean, look at France as a particular example, where there's a large Muslim community. It becomes an offense now for you to wear the niqab for that matter in a public place, you can get arrested and locked up and put in jail for that. So most of these ideas that are being promoted by these new atheists are slowly, to a certain extent, being adopted by these Western secular governments. And so, as a Muslim, we need to understand that in approaching these individuals, we don't approach them particularly in the manner that we would traditionally approach a Christian or a Jew. So we need to obviously develop, and in the session tomorrow and maybe the session next week, I will focus on some of the issues in terms of how to deal with this aspect of new atheism and some of the arguments that we can basically deal with in terms of detailing the information. Besides that, most of these individuals get a large amount of publicity time. So on BBC, on ITV, on Fox News for that particular matter, their views are viewed as more rational, as more logical, and as more standard. Anyone who, for example, criticizes Darwin's theory of evolution, and it's been torn apart, trust me, it has, and I'm not talking about Harun Yahya or studying the works of Harun Yahya, which is good. He's, for an introductory level, he's collated information which is very powerful. But if you look at many mainstream scientists, they will tell you that evolution, the very basis of the foundation of Darwinism and what it was initially based on, has just totally demolished completely. But the point is that in mainstream universities and schools, it's taught as a fact, and it's not a fact. So these are some of the individuals, Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and so on. And a lot of them also happen to be ex-Muslims who subsequently joined these particular individuals in promoting their particular ideas and concepts. Can a Muslim be an atheist? Or does the Quran, for example, focus or deal with the idea on atheism? Well, if you look at Surah Al-Anbiya, chapter 21, verse 30, the classic verse, which is more particularly a challenge out there to people, أَوَلَمْ يَرَوْا الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَنَّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ كَانَتَا رَتْقًا فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا. Do not be those who disbelieve, meaning the atheists. Atheists are unbelievers, they reject faith. Kufr means a deliberate act of rejecting faith. Kufr. See how the heavens and the earth were joined together as one unit of creation before we clove them asunder. So the point is in the short, and that we made everything from water. وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ أَفَلَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. Will they then not believe? The point is that the Quranic verse, and in reading the Quran itself, the text of the Quran points you with key passages and argumentations that you can use in terms of dealing with this particular people. So, for example, you have here a striking congruence between this Quranic verse and the inescapable fact which people suggest that billions upon billions of years, there was nothing. Suddenly, there was a massive explosion and creation basically happened. Question is that if this is appealing to atheists, if this is appealing to unbelievers, and this is a proclamation made, as Muslims claim, under revelation by the Prophet, by a man living in the desert 1400 years ago, then how could it identify such a particular fact? Can you see that? How does it identify something which should not ordinarily have been known to him? How does it identify something? Or, for example, when the Quran says, وَالْأَرْضَ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ دَحَاهَا, that moreover the earth, have we made it, the word dahaha, the Arab people here, what does dahaha mean? Does it mean like egg-shaped? The earth, have we made it egg-shaped? وَالْأَرْضَ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ دَحَاهَا.
To make it easier to...
Yeah, would a correct translation not be something which is oval-shaped, egg-shaped?
Sure.
Something like that. Or kawara, the coiling of the night over the day. So this basically points out to the geospherical shape of the particular earth. Now again, someone like that, someone living 1400 years ago in the desert, should not ordinarily be able to know this. So these are some of the issues that you can use and that we can use in dealing with people. And we come across them all the time in universities, in your academic institutions, in your day-to-day affairs, in your day-to-day life that you have and your interaction with people. So again and again, nothing, no ideology, no system, no way of life out there that is presented before us should provide any form of threat or challenge to us, because from the Quranic point of view, the particular answers and the response are effectively given in respect of that. Again, one could go on. Chinese religions generally, people ask, what about the adoption of Chinese religions? And this goes back to my thesis about people wanting to look at the philosophies of the East. Most of the Chinese religions in general are more particularly system of ethics. So something like Confucianism, even though religion during the time of communist China, when Mao Zedong was in a position of leadership, you find that Christianity was severely repressed, and your mainstream faith like Islam, for example, would be severely repressed. But something like Confucianism would kind of still flourish, even in a state which effectively was communist in nature, which basically lends us to the principle that these religions in general were more systems of ethics as opposed to actual worldviews. If you look at, for example, the Shinto religion, Shintoism, the kind of fundamentals of Shintoism in its classical form is how, or the ability to live as a good Japanese citizen. So Shinto is a religion that celebrates life, the mountain, an item of worship and praise, the entry to the shrine, an item of the lives of many, the sun representing the sun god and our view on life. But more particularly, it wasn't something which was a holistic, monotheistic worldview with a way, with a pattern, with ready-made restrictions, with certain guidelines, with certain precepts that we need to adopt. None of this was any of this. So coming to the idea, these religions which are being adopted by the New Age movement are adopted because in many senses they don't pose a kind of a challenge or a paradigm shift to how people live. So for example, if a person wants to be a drinker and following these particular different ways and different systems that he can adopt, although he claims to be spiritually rejuvenated, he can still engage in a licentious style of behavior and so on. But they don't present a meaningful challenge or a paradigm shift to his particular way or his pattern. Buddhism, we focused on Buddhism. One of the things that I forgot to mention was that Buddha was in fact a Hindu. You see, all the representations that you have of Buddha with the Chinese eyes, he wasn't Chinese, nor was he Japanese. Where does he come from? He comes from India. Buddha, in fact, came from the northern part of India. So where do the Chinese features come from? He was an individual that was dissatisfied with Buddhism. He spoke about four noble truths: the ordinary life that brings about suffering, the origin of suffering is attachment, the cessation of suffering is attainable, and there was an eightfold path to the cessation of suffering. But the point is that the whole edifice of Buddhism also focuses on Buddha's spiritual journey. But there was no system. There was no way where, at least from the existing Buddhist theology, where he called people to the worship of the oneness of God. He may have said that. We don't know. As the Buddhist literature that is contained, all the focus points out to his particular dissatisfaction that he had with Hinduism. Because of the fact that there was nothing which was centrally focused that he called upon, what happened? People then focused on him. Because he had nothing, at least in the religious teachings, there was nothing which pointed out to the idea of the supreme being or the creator itself. So the focal point effectively pointed to him. So Buddha then became the God. He became the one that the focal point was on. Even though he claimed, when he was asked, "Who are you?" he said, "I am awake." He never claimed to be God, but the focal point went on to him. So can you see that each and every system that you go through has fundamental shortcomings that can be identified and that can, of course, be pointed out in discussions with people from different communications. Now, we focused a bit on the idea of Judaism. I don't want to go into that. This deals, I might just focus on this. What is a fundamental source on Judaism? What do Jews rely on? What's their book? The Torah. Well, the Torah comprises what? What is the Torah? Psalms. What is Torah? I haven't gone into discussion on the Bible, but what is the Torah?
As they say or as we believe?
As they say.
It's the speech of Allah or something.
No, as they say, that's correct. As they say, they believe the Torah is the Pentateuch, the 5 books. The 5 books allegedly written by Moses under inspiration. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then, of course, you've got the writings of the other prophets, the writings of the prophets. But that's not the Torah. That forms part of the Tanakh. But the Torah basically is the 5 books, the Pentateuch, what we would classify as the 5 books of Moses, the Torah. The Old Testament is not the Torah. That is material over and above the Torah, which they follow, and that is a source of authority. But they don't refer to the Old Testament as the Torah. When they refer to the Torah, they refer to the 5 books as their books of authority. Now, just on that point, the oldest manuscripts that you have on the Torah and the Old Testament, meaning the 5 books and the rest of the Old Testament, 39 books in total, date from the 10th century of the Common Era. Bearing in mind that Moses, according to their calculations, lived some 2,000 years before Jesus. That's according to their calculations, which is not accurate. But the oldest that we have in the world today dates from the 10th century of the Common Era, meaning it's even 1,000 years after Jesus. Meaning if there was an Old Testament or a Torah that these Jews believe existed in the time of Jesus, it couldn't have been this, because these manuscripts date later. If I were to basically, I give this example, if all of you were to write something down here, and 1,000 years from now, I have remnants, I discover remnants, or at least 2,000 years from now, I discover remnants of what you wrote, but they date to 1,000 years, which were written by other people. Would I be able to trace that they were the same that you wrote?
No.
If through a means of carbon dating, I date manuscripts or writings 1,000 years after you were sitting here, detailing an event that you wrote down or notes that you made, would I be sure that those notes would accurately reflect what was written 1,000 years before by you? Absolutely not. And so that's the position that you have here. You have material which is 1,000 years after Christ and would be about 3,000 years after Moses, if they say that Moses lived 2,000 years before Christ. So that would mean close to 3,000 years later. That is the oldest manuscripts that you have in reference to the Old Testament, what is called the Masoretic text. So that is the source. From a manuscript point of view, how can you be so accurate or sure that that material accurately reflects what was even in the time of Jesus? You cannot be sure. So can you see the difficulty that you've got just on that particular point alone? Can you be a Jew? Can you even consider adopting Judaism when the source in terms of which you define and denote your identity comes from material which is so suspect and so primitive, but at the same time so many years and centuries after the events had in fact occurred? Can you see the problem that you've got there? Again, the idea of Christian, or the adopting the Christian term, we focus on Jesus never heard the term, he never used it, it was a label given in Antioch. This is the problem we've got. You see, have all of you seen what's called the New Testament? Have you? Or have you seen the New Testament? Is it banned in Saudi Arabia? Are you allowed to have a Bible? Because we're going to give you Bibles, and if they're going to stop you at the airport, then you can tell them that IPCI gave you copies of the Bibles. Sorry, are you allowed to have copies? Soft copies on electronic format. You can't have hard copies. We're going to give you hard copies. We don't have a Bible on memory stick. So you'll be taking hard copies away with you. But just to explain this point here that I want to illustrate. If you look at the New Testament, you've heard of the New Testament? right? It's a book comprising 27 booklets believed by Christians, right? If you look at a book like this is just a copy of the New Testament. The New Testament is something like this. This is the New Testament. This is the New Testament. Can you see this? And this here is the Old Testament. This is the Old Testament. This is the New Testament.
You mean what Protestants?
No. Protestants. The Protestant movement, that's something separate. The Protestant movement is a reformation. It reformed from something which was called Roman Catholicism.
I mean, I'm usually reading the comments on this. I mean, do they make it, or other people make it?
No. Well, I'll come to that shortly. Protestant, you see, there are two. Let me just explain this. There are two major groups in the Christian world: the Roman Catholics and the Protestants. Roman Catholics were the original early church. That developed in the 4th, 5th, and 6th century, right? In 1600s and the 1400s, through the Reformation and the efforts of people like Martin Luther, people reformed from what they saw as abuses and excesses of the church, and so they protested away from these abuses, and they became known as the Protestants. Collectively, in the Christian world, whether you're a Roman Catholic or whether you're a Protestant, you follow one whole book, which is the Bible. Old Testament, New Testament. In the Bible in question, this book doesn't identify itself as a Bible. It doesn't say, I am the Holy Bible, like the Quran identifies itself in numerous places. This doesn't say Holy Bible. The word Bible comes from the Greek word biblos, which means books. Books referring to all these books. Old Testament, remember, traditionally followed by Jews. New Testament, referring to the biographical accounts about Jesus, written allegedly by his disciples. Two of his disciples, one was a physician, not his disciple, and one was a 10-year-old boy, and written by an individual called Paul, who never saw Jesus, but had a vision, which he purportedly saw Jesus, who tells him, why are you persecuting me? Why are you persecuting your church? And then Paul apparently converts, and he starts writing and preaches to the different churches. Now, collectively, this is followed by Christians. Old Testament and New. The first half of this book, Old Testament, is followed by Jews, and they reject the New Testament. Christians follow and get their source of authority from the New Testament, but they also believe that the Old Testament was inspired by God. So they give equal authority to it, but they believe that the laws and the teachings in Leviticus giving the strict laws and regulations are no longer relevant to them because they're living under grace.
So Jewish and Christian, they follow the same?
No, the Jews basically follow the first half, which is the Old Testament.
So the same half?
Yeah, but they've got it in a different form. They've got different publications and so on.
What's the Torah?
Not the Torah. They follow what they call the Torah and other books. So the Torah is the first 5 books. There are 39 books in the Old Testament. 5 of them are what we would call the Torah, the Pentateuch, and the balance are other books, the writings of the prophets, the writings of the kings, and so on and so forth. New Testament, 27 books, followed by Christians who believe it's the revelation given to these particular individuals, but effectively they also give equal authority to the Old Testament. Is that clear? Yes.
Yes. You just said about the Torah in the Jews, the oldest document that they found is about 1,000 years ago. So does it mean that Christians have an older and oldest discoveries, and the Jews just have much older?
Yeah. Look, up until 1611, when they had a publication of what they call a King James Version in English, up until 1611, the manuscripts that these particular translators drew from in respect of the entire Bible, including the New Testament, came from the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th century. And then subsequently, in about the 1800s, when more discoveries were made, discoveries of manuscripts that were dating to, for example, the 4th, 5th, and 6th century, but those manuscripts were discovered only in relation to the New Testament. So in respect of the Hebrew Old Testament, get this clear, we're talking about the Hebrew Old. The oldest are existent from the 10th century. That's the oldest that you've got. There's nothing older than this. In Hebrew, nothing older than this. And they call it something called the Biblia Hebraica. Biblia Hebraica. It's a title that they give to the particular manuscripts. And what they describe in the Masoretic text derived from the way that the vowels are basically written. Because Hebrew and Arabic initially were without vowelization. So with the vowels, it basically makes it easier for pronunciation. This was the oldest that they've got. There's nothing older beyond that. For a Christian, the oldest manuscripts dates to probably the 4th century. We'll discuss that. It's something called the Codex Sinaiticus. And then they've got something even earlier than that, which is called the Chester Beatty Papyri. And that is, if I've got it here, that's about the size of my credit card. That's the oldest, the debit card. That's the oldest that they've got of the Chester Beatty Papyri. It's a small fragment from something called the Gospel of John, and that dates to that particular time. There's nothing earlier than that. That is the oldest that they've got. And that dates to about the 2nd century, close to about 200 years or 150 years after Jesus. And then the oldest complete New Testament that they have, which has additional books, comes to about the 4th century, Codex Sinaiticus. Yes, sir?
Within the Jewish society, what significance does the Talmud play?
Yeah. The Talmud is a body of oral tradition, a collection of writings made by rabbis. A lot of it comprises of commentaries on the existing Old Testament, and a lot of it also comprises of particularly writings, laws, and legislation that they might have over and above what's contained in the existing New Testament. So the Talmud basically would be a series of writings based about what's contained in the existing Old Testament and other material that rabbis and writers may basically have, which may be authentic and some of it may not be. But it's not to be confused with what's contained in the Old Testament. It's a totally separate body of writing entirely. It's a separate body of writing, and they don't ascribe divine authority to that. So the Talmudic writings are something totally different. But we're not going to focus on the Talmud because that's not something which they ascribe as being divinely inspired, to my knowledge. We're going to focus on effectively what's contained as their source, the Pentateuch, the Hexateuch with the books of Joshua, and of course the remaining of the Old Testament. Okay, any other questions on that point? So remember, this easy thing to remember is that Old Testament, 39 books, New Testament, 27 books. Now they call this Pentateuch the Torah. We also believe in the Torah. Am I correct? Yes. We also believe in the Torah. Now, is our Torah, what is our Torah? What is the Torah we believe in? Yeah, the book that was sent to Moses. Is that the Torah? Is the Torah, linguistically we know the same. They are the same. But if someone were to say, we believe in the Torah, and a Jew were to come to you and says he has the Torah, would the Torah be referring to the Torah that they claim is in fact the Torah? No, what would the Torah be, as the brother correctly pointed out?
The original.
Yeah, you're correct in saying, in a simplistic layman's term, what is Torah? Wahi, the revelation that was given to Musa alayhi salam. Do we have it in its existent form in the world today at all? No, we don't have it at all. What would the Zabur be? We have a book called the Psalms in the Old Testament, attributed to David. Is the Zabur the Psalms? Of course not. It's not. The Zabur and the Psalms are totally different. If you look at the internal contents of the Psalms, of such a despicable nature that you cannot believe that God himself would inspire David with such particular teachings about crashing infants against the rocks and so on. That could never be the Psalms. And then Injil, what would we say it is? What would the Injil be? What is the Injil? Revelation, Wahi. revelation to Isa alayhi salam. So do we have the Injil today? No. So why do people believe mistakenly that when they're referring to Injil, they refer to the New Testament? Well, why do people have this belief? They have this idea.
It's because of what it says the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah, you see, how would you describe Matthew in Arabic? The Gospel of Matthew. Is it Injil Matthew? Well, how would you describe it in Arabic? Anyone? Yeah, many people would refer to it as a Gospel of Matthew, and you could, but actually, in actual fact, what falls or purports to be a gospel is not that gospel that was given to Jesus, or was not the Injil or Evangelion that was given to Jesus. Good news. That was not what is contained here is not what the belief is. So get this clearly in our minds, that what we believe is revelation given to different prophets. Historically, religiously, and archaeologically does not exist today. It doesn't exist. Even if you do carbon date, you'll never be able to trace any material dating back which can be said to be those of Jesus. The materials that do exist come 400 or 500 years after him, and they don't even appear to be his. They appear to be the writings of other people that were purportedly his disciples. But even when you analyze that, you discover that they were not his writings. The one problem that we do have is this, that we can obviously take cognizance of, again boiling down to language. When Jesus spoke, what language did he speak in? Arabic. Aramaic. And one example of Aramaic is, let me give you, I think this may be a classic example of Aramaic. This would be Aramaic. This would be probably some remnants of it. That would be the language he would be speaking in, Jesus, if at all. Maybe Hebrew, but as I said earlier on, the term Hebrew is problematic because calling a language Hebrew evolved in the 7th and 8th century. And look it up, even look it up on Wikipedia, it'll tell you the same thing. So if this was a language that he spoke, and the existing booklets that are written about him, not to him, but are written about him, allegedly, by people who purportedly were his disciples, they were written in the Koine Greek language. That would indicate that teachings existent in the original language of Christ are no longer with us. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So even on the assumption, get this clear, even on the assumption that if you were to perform carbon dating and trace existing Greek manuscripts to the very time that he lived, that would still not be sufficient, because the material that you would have about him would be in a secondary language. So if I were to and that would not be the word of God. So if I were to, for example, trace back a Quran, which would be impossible, let's just assuming, trace back a Quran in English, which never existed, but for sake of argument, in English to the 6th century, exactly to the time of the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, would that be the Quran? Of course not, because that would be a secondary translation, at best an interpretation. And that's the difficulty that you have this, that even on the assumption that you have material which would be original, you would still have a problem with the language, because the language is in a secondary material, and particularly in a bad secondary material, because Koine Greek is a type of Greek which is very rudimentary and grammatically badly written. So if this was inspired by God, how would God basically inspire it in such a grammatically badly written style of language or style of communication? So that is a particular problem. What? Yes.
What does it looks like to be?
I beg your pardon?
This is Hebrew.
It's not Hebrew. Aramaic.
Is there any Hebrew?
In the New Testament? No, there is no. They are what you would call people, Jews, there's a group, for example, called Jews for Jesus that translate the New Testament in Hebrew, but there's no Hebrew New Testament. The New Testament has always been in Greek. There is no Hebrew New Testament. Yes?
Who said, and how do you know this language of Jesus?
Well, this is what basically scholars would purport to suggest. Again, nobody knows, but they trace the fact that at that particular point in time, the common language spoken in that particular region would possibly have been Aramaic, and so they believe that if that was the case, he would have either spoken Aramaic or possibly Hebrew, but definitely not Greek. And there's no practical indication that he had any understanding of Greek. This is Greek. This is the Koine Greek that we are talking about. Jesus never spoke that particular language. It was totally different. Now, I just want to go back to my original slide, which I had here. When you analyze something which is called the standard theory synoptic problem, when people write, there are ways of determining where information comes from. Okay? Sometimes you want to copy someone's work. Sometimes you want to write on your own. But there is a style of influence in terms of which all of us have a way, a means of communication. There are 4 books. And tell me if this gets a bit boring or complex. There are 4 books in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Have you heard of them?
Yes.
All of you have heard of them? Right. Matthew comes first, Mark comes second, Luke comes third, and John comes fourth. Now, in terms of the latest scholarly studies, recently in the 20th century, they have come to the conclusion that the first book written, purportedly, was this book here, called Mark. Then comes Luke and Matthew, and then John is possibly the last gospel that was written.
There's fifth one.
Which is the 5th one? There's the Acts of the Apostles by the writer Luke, but there's no 5th gospel. There's the 4 gospels in general in the New Testament. There's no 5th gospel. There are just 4 main gospels, and there's a... Which gospel?
Yeah, actually I forgot its name, but there's...
Barnabas.
I'm not sure. It's an explanation or something like that. The Christian people do not believe in it because they remove it after.
Barnabas.
I guess so.
Yeah, no, that is something else. Gospel of Barnabas is something entirely different, but we're not going to deal with the Gospel of Barnabas now. Now, this is how it works. They said that this was the first written, and if you look at it, all the writings are biographical, meaning I've got 4 people here in the front, right? And from today, the morning, to next week, all of 4 of you are going to write everything that happens, right? Your writings are not going to be the same, okay? But you'll be writing about the same event. All right. And that's how it is with the Gospels. They all write about the same events, but the style is different. But the difference is that they claim to have been inspired by the Holy Spirit or divinely inspired. So if that was the case, then effectively there should be congruity. There should not be any form of contradiction or anything along that line. But that is the basic thesis given, that there are 4 different writers writing about a series of events, and there are parallels that happen. Now, when they analyzed these parallels, they discovered this, that if you put this as the first, this as the second, and this as the third, they found out that when they looked at the different stories, both these particular writings, both these particular books made use of this as a source. And then they also found, because they found material that was in both of these writings, and that was almost identical to what's contained here. So if you find something that is here, and it is replicated in 2 books which are said to be written later, it stands to reason that they are copied. People are copying them, am I correct?
Yeah.
So if I find, for example, all of you were to write something about what happened, and I find that you submitted your your letters first, and then you guys came second, and then I find when they submitted it, it's identical to what you got. The presumption is that you copied that particular person, and then you gave it later. So this is a conclusion that they found, that these people made copy from this. And then they found that there was material that was almost identical to each other, but was not to be found here. So they basically said that there must have been another source from which they copied from, and that source is called Q. Q means Quelle. A German term for sources means it's a hypothetical source of Jesus' sayings used by both Luke and Matthew. So there's material that are identical here, which is found here. They trace it to here. There's material that are identical to each other. They trace it there. And then there's material, which is a small minority of percentage of material that is independent to each other. And they say that it's possible that there may have been a previous source that they may have also borrowed from to write and basically utilize for purposes